Hi, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our flipped lecture series. We are going to start our flipped lessons with our last set of notes on Reconstruction, and they center around the failure of Reconstruction and what happens after Reconstruction's over when President Hayes removes those federal troops from the South. So to give us an overview, I want to talk about these 5 topics when we discuss why Reconstruction fails. The first one being the legacy of racism that exists in the South. So we know that slavery was not something new in the South at this point. It had been around for hundreds of years. In the colonies, the first slaves were sold in Jamestown in 1607, and there are reports that Spanish settlers had slaves in Florida as early as the late 1500s. So we're not going to overnight, or even in the span of 10 years when Reconstruction happens, change the beliefs of people in the North and the South. And at this point, they still do not believe that African Americans are equal to whites. The South, under the Black Codes and the new economic policies that they set, are going to create this system of sharecropping. And those tenant farmers that are now farming, in many cases, the land of their old owners, are going to be dependent on them, and they will not have been given their own land, which is going to mean that they're never going to be able to get out of this cycle of basically legal slavery. Freedmen, also because they lack education and political experience, it's going to take them a number of years to fight for rights and to learn how to do those things because they just never have had the experience of doing that before. We know that under slavery, it was illegal for slaves to be able to read and write. So what the Freedmen's Bureau does in setting up schools and universities is really important. It's going to not only teach people how to read and write, but also teach them how to fight for themselves and their rights and how to vote and participate in public life. While those things are going on, people in the South, especially white people, are still going to be very angry, not over only losing the war, but also the new policies that are being set by the radical Republicans and the president. And you're going to get white terrorist organizations that are going to spring up in the South. The one that everybody seems to know is the Ku Klux Klan, or the KKK. But there were a number of other terrorist organizations, such as the White League, the Knights of Camilla, Red Shirts, who were also racist groups. The main goal of these racist groups in the South was to threaten African Americans who tried to get involved in politics and scare them away. Those scare tactics are going to work at first, but as time goes on, those groups are going to become more violent, and it's going to lead to lynchings and many other things that are going to affect African Americans for years to come. At this time, the North is also going to lose interest in Southern Reconstruction and helping the South. We are going to get, at the end of the 1800s, a huge immigration influx. People from all over Europe are going to start pouring into the United States, and the North is going to have this large population boom. They're going to have mass industrialization, so their factories are going to change, and all of these things are going to take energy away from Southern Reconstruction, and Northerners are going to want to focus on what's happening where they are and not on what's happening in the South. So this is really going to lead to what's left when the North stops paying attention. And what we get in the South really is a system of racial segregation and white supremacy. So supremacy means that you think that you're better than somebody else. And in this case, in the South, we had white supremacy. So whites believed that they were better than any other race. And this becomes normal in the South. They're going to deprive or take away African Americans' basic political and civil rights. And this period of time is going to be known as the nadir, or the low point. When you see the word nadir, it generally refers to race relations. And in America, that is generally between whites and African Americans. So we're going to also get a lot of political cartoons. So the newspapers in the North and the abolitionists who helped during the Civil War are not going to give up on the South. They're going to put cartoons, and they're going to write articles to try to keep people interested in what's happening and try to support African American rights and freedoms. So these are examples of some of the pictures that you may have seen in northern newspapers. So on the left is a drawing of the Ku Klux Klan. So as this organization starts to grow and starts to do horrible things, people take notice. So you get newspaper articles published, and then you also on the right have what was done by groups like the Ku Klux Klan. This is lynchings, so we'll discuss it more in a second. So it wasn't uncommon to see these pictures put into newspapers at the time to raise awareness of what was happening to African Americans still in the South. Here's another example of a cartoon with the caption, "Of course he wants to vote for the Democratic ticket." So this was showing that we knew, and we discussed in class, African Americans at the time were predominantly Republican. So Lincoln's party, the party of Lincoln, and the radical Republicans were instrumental in getting African Americans freed and giving them votes in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. So many African Americans are Republicans. So when they would show up to vote, it wasn't uncommon, as you see in the picture, for them to be threatened and told that they needed to vote for the Democratic Party instead of the Republican Party. When the 15th Amendment had guaranteed African Americans the right to vote, but the South did not want all of those newly freed slaves to vote because they knew that they would vote for the Republicans and their people who they had running for office would lose. So they would threaten violence to people who tried to vote, and lynchings became common. So as you can see on the right, a lynching is a public hanging by a local mob without a trial. So generally, an African American would be accused of some crime or something, and a big group of white citizens would come to the house and drag that person out. They would have a trial in the middle of the street, and then the crowd would serve justice, which would be to kill the individuals by hanging them up and in a tree in the backyard. At this time, all of the police, the juries, and the judges in town are white. If you remember from the black codes that we talked about in class, it was illegal for African Americans to serve on juries, and it was illegal for them to testify in court. So really, justice was out of reach for many African Americans during this time period in history. A very famous cartoonist that did a lot of cartoons about Reconstruction was a man by the name of Thomas Nast. So he is the person who draws and creates the cartoons and the symbols for the Republican and Democratic parties, so the elephant and the donkey. The reason that that's the symbols for the party is because of the man who did this same cartoon, Thomas Nast. So this is a cartoon that was published that shows the failure of federal enforcement, so that the federal government set and had really good intentions of trying to protect African Americans in the South, but they weren't able to do it. That groups like the KKK and the White League came, and as you can see from the caption, it says worse than slavery. So these organizations would come about and do everything that they could to try to terrorize and keep African Americans down. And unfortunately, this is a system that's going to continue for a long time. The Southern legislators during Reconstruction passed black codes, and those stopped African Americans from having a lot of rights. That's going to continue, and more laws are going to be passed after Reconstruction ends. They usually center around the 14th and 15th Amendments and stopping people from having equal rights and their voting rights. Some of the things that the Southern legislatures would do to try to stop people from voting are the three items mentioned here. So literacy tests, poll taxes, and grandfather clauses. So a literacy test was basically a test that you had to go take in order to qualify to vote. And it was a test to see whether or not you could read or write. Well, African Americans, we know, couldn't read or write because they didn't have education. And they ended up with a problem in the South because a lot of the Southern whites couldn't read and write either. But they figured out a way to basically let those white Southerners in, and that was through the grandfather clauses. So they passed a law saying that if you had people in your family, so say your parents or your grandparents, who were qualified voters before 1867, then you were going to be allowed to vote without having to pass a literacy test. This ends up affecting African Americans because they're slaves before 1867, no one in their family would have been able to vote. Therefore, no slave, ex-slave freedman now is going to be able to get grandfathered in to vote. The last thing that they tried to do centered around money, so it was poll taxes. So basically, in order to register to vote like we do now, you had to pay a fee, but we don't pay fees. But they would basically charge everyone that wanted to come in and vote a registration fee. Since freedmen are stuck in sharecropping, they have very little extra money to go around, and they never end up having the money to spare to be able to pay the poll taxes, so then they can't vote. These laws that are passed are known as Jim Crow laws. So a lot of them, many of them, center around segregation, which is to keep people separate. So in this case, African Americans from whites. A lot of the Jim Crow laws had to do with facilities, so separate bathrooms, separate schools, separate train cars, telephone booths, cemeteries, basically you name it, and it was separate. Whites and blacks couldn't do it together. It reinforced white racism and denied black citizens equal rights and opportunities because almost always the facilities that were given to African Americans were not going to be as good as what was given to the white citizens. White Southerners liked these laws because they were afraid of competition from black workers, and they wanted to, quote unquote, keep freedmen in their places. Some examples of these laws are the ones I have here. They are centered around everything from children to marriage. So if you were a white woman and you had a child with anyone other than a white man in the state of Maryland, you were going to go to jail for 18 months after that child was born. In Texas, you had to have separate schools for whites and colored children. And in Florida, if you were a white person, you could only be married to a white person. You could not marry a person of color or a person of Hispanic descent. And if you did, it was punishable by time in jail, or your marriage would basically be considered void, and they would just say, nope, you're not married. One case that is famous that ends up making segregation legal is this case, Plessy versus Ferguson. So a lot of people challenged the Jim Crow laws in the South, especially to see if the court was actually going to say, yes, you could have separate facilities. One of these cases was Homer Plessy, a black man who could pass as a white man, went and sat in Louisiana on a railway car for white people. He gets arrested and he goes to court. The case makes it all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court rules that separate but equal is okay. That whites and blacks were not meant to be together, and so as long as you have equal facilities, they can be separate, and that's okay. This is going to stay in place for almost 100 years until we get the Brown versus the Board of Education decision in 1954. In response to this, a lot of African Americans are going to leave. They're just the ones that are able are not going to stay and deal with Jim Crow in the South, so they're going to pack up their families and move to cities like Chicago and New York and Seattle. Florida is not an exception. We were the South, we are the South. So during Reconstruction, things change at first a little, but then Jim Crow is going to appear. So we go from all cotton to citrus and to vegetables, and then people come and visit our beaches. And African Americans are very active at first in government, but then we're going to see the literacy tests and the poll taxes and the violence. Groups like the KKK coming into Florida. So you can see the pictures on the right. We've got beaches. The one up top is from Miami. These are both, I think, in the Miami area. No, Butler Beach is Jacksonville, I believe. But you're going to have separate facilities. So whites and blacks couldn't go to the same beach. You had separate beaches, separate bathing houses, places to change, bathrooms. So Florida had the same laws that the rest of the South had. And I'm going to leave you with this, one of Florida's laws on for Jim Crow laws, and we will discuss it in class. So don't forget to answer the questions that go along with this Google form and push the submit button. And I will see you tomorrow in class, and we will discuss Jim Crow and the KKK more.